I have the privilege this morning of chairing this panel. My name is Asaf Romirowsky. I am currently the Acting Executive Director of Scholars for Peace in the Middle East. I'm also an adjunct scholar at the Middle East Forum and a professor at Drexel University. This roundtable this morning is entitled From Kissinger to Kerry, 40 Years of Failed Attempts to Solve the Arab-Israeli Conflict. And so let me start by introducing everybody, and then we can go into the meat and potatoes of the argument so we can get into the heart of the issue. To my far left is Dr. Motti Kedar. Dr. Kedar served in the IDF for 25 years in military intelligence, specializing in Syria, Arab political discourse, Arab mass media, Islamic groups, and Israeli Arabs. He's an expert on the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist groups. Very prolific, and we're very privileged to have him here all the way from Bar-Ilan. So he's on the far left. In the middle, we have Professor Ofira Seliktar. Ofira is a prolific researcher and a writer, been with Gratz College in political science for many years. She was a scholar in residence at the Middle East Research Institute at the University of Pennsylvania. She authored eight books, in articles, many articles. Her last book was about navigating Iran from Carter to Obama, which tracks the entire history of the American relations with the Islamist regime of Tehran. And she has written a wonderful book about the failure of Oslo, which she'll be talking about it, I'm sure, today in our panel. Last but not least, my good friend Lee Smith. Lee is a senior editor at the Weekly Standard and the author of The Strong Horse, Power, Politics, and the Clash of Arab Civilizations, and an expert on the Arab mindset and what's happening on the Arab street. So a lot to say on that as well. My expertise also deals with Palestinian refugees, and I will chime in at some point to deal with that, depending on how much time we have. Given our time constraints, everybody will have maximum about 10 minutes to present their presentations, and then hopefully we'll go into a lively Q&A. We'll start with Ofira, and then with Motti and Lee, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Asaf, for inviting me here. I think it's a wonderful opportunity for me to look at what happened during the Oslo peace process and bring it forward all these years later. And when I was asked to do that, I decided that a good way to present it would be to see Oslo as a template for failure so far to negotiate a peace between Israel and the Palestinians, and partially it's based on my book, Doomed to Failure, but other things are also included. Now, there is a long-standing tradition, academic tradition, I should say, which stipulates that countries or entities come to a realization that they need to sign a peace treaty when the time is ripe. Now, this is also known as conflict resolution theory in many, many different ways. It says the same thing, that when the time is right, there's no ripeness, sort of like a ripeness theory, they would come and get together. So with that in mind, people who pushed for the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians, including a lot of the Israelis, decided that the time was ripe. However, the problem was that it was not ripe, especially not ripe on the Palestinian side. Why did the Israelis get into the process? Because the Palestinians increased the cost of doing business, of keeping the territories. Intifada is not a pleasant way of dealing with problems. They lost a lot of legitimacy. If you still may remember what the late Yitzhak Rabin said, he said, we will break their bones, etc. That didn't go very well. Now, so there were all sorts of reasons why they decided. They also said that we should rather do it with Yasser Arafat now because the Islamists are much worse, and let's just finish the business. Now, this thing was pushed by what I call a determined coalition of the best and brightest Israeli version of it. Intellectuals, academics, left-wing politicians, etc. Now, What were, as I said, the assumptions about the peace process? The International Relations Theory of Ripeness said, now is the time to get from conflict management to conflict resolution. And one of the major assumptions was the Palestinian people are ready for nation building. Yasser Arafat is the Palestinian version of Nelson Mandela. These were the assumptions. What was the reality? Essentially, the reality on the ground was nothing but the antithesis of the assumptions. There was no readiness for nation building. This was a society which was profound and structural problems. Arafat was nothing like Nelson Mandela. In my book, I touch upon problems like cognitive capacity, etc. I cannot go into it. But the most important thing, I should say, that by the time Arafat and Rabin shook hands on the White House lawn with President Clinton between them, Arafat lost control of the territories by that time. No one knew it, and even Arafat didn't know it. And I'm not saying that facetiously. It's very difficult to say who is in charge with whom in a situation like this. Now, one of the things that were not appreciated were the Iranian factor. As I said, the critical meeting took place in January 1994. It was decided that the peace process is an existential threat to the regime, and they decided to use the weapon that they knew how to use it since 1983, which they perfected in Lebanon, and that's suicide bombings. So that, of course, eroded much of the goodwill and the political backing for the peace process in Israel. Now, at the time, it's really not clear, and I wrote a whole book. I write books about predictive failures, looking back at what happened, who knew what and why and when, but it's even for me, it's very hard to say after reading all these documents what the Israelis understood. I should say that the intelligence and the military community totally collapsed. They essentially formed two warring factions. One said Arafat is still the man and he is in charge and we can do it. The other faction said this is nonsense. I can expand on it later. Now, I apologize for using a mixed metaphor here for Barak. I couldn't find a Jewish equivalent of Hail Mary pass. If anyone in the audience can help me, I would be very grateful. What Barak did, and I talked to him, and he said, that's what he actually explained to me. He said, I had no faith in Arafat, but I wanted to squeeze the guy. He used the term smoke him out in Hebrew. In English. I spoke to him in English. But at the same time, he offered a great deal, which you can see, known as the Clinton parameters. That didn't go anywhere as well as the Israelis and the Americans were thinking it would go. So that went down the tubes, and now we are actually, the part that I wanted to discuss is how this framework for failure applies to what is going now, and why is it that America cannot solve the problem. Now, some of the things that I say are known, some are probably less known. The American involvement is very deep and very profound, essentially goes back to the creation of the State of Israel. There was always a residue of unease in various quarters, American quarters, about the creation of the State of Israel. And the idea was, well, we have to deal with it, but after the Six-Day War, the unease became increased, became very, very pronounced. One of the interesting things is that President Johnson determined that it's okay for Israel to be within the Green Line, but not beyond the Green Line. And interestingly enough, he was the first to, he was not personally, but his former aide and national security advisor, McGeorge Bundy, was the first to set up this very intricate, very dense network of things that would remind the Israelis that they should not be in the West Bank and they shouldn't think about being in the West Bank. The first thing that Bundy did when he became the chair of the Ford Foundation was to establish projects and programs which started this issue. One of my good friends, which I don't want to mention his name, lived very nicely off the Ford Foundation for many, many years, saying things are very bad. So this is the type of state. And then there is, of course, the very legitimate issue of the pro-Palestinian lobby in this country. Like the Jewish lobby, in my opinion, they have the right to say what they want to say and put their money where their mouth is. So all this made this issue alive. It wasn't a dead issue. Now, why do they try so hard even if they fail? I should say that all American presidents since Johnson tried to save the issue, tried to resolve the conflict. The only exception was George W. Bush, because he was so busy in Iraq that he didn't really pay much attention to the West Bank. And still today, the golden parameters, the golden standards are the Clinton parameters. And that's why there is such a push by every single president, and some push harder than others. Now, the question that is being normally asked a lot of, why is it that people do the same thing all over and they fail all over? And I think that's what Asaf meant when he very creatively called this panel from Kissinger to Kerry. Why is it that the Americans are doing the same thing over and over again? Some people think that they are intellectually blind or culturally stupid, that they don't understand the complexities of the issues in the Middle East. That, in my opinion, is not correct. Why do the Americans do it? I listed a number of goals. Why? One of them is that by keeping the issue alive, merely by creating a group or a person that is in charge of conflict resolution, they prevent it from going into the mode of conflict management, which is the Israeli preferential mode. Well, we shall manage it. Maybe 30, 40 years from now, things would get better. The Americans are dead set on preventing it, every single president, no matter what party, because that increases the cost of doing business for Israel in the same effective way, maybe not as effective as the Intifada. Now, I have done a lot of work on intelligence. My biggest question is, and I don't have any answers to it, whether the Kerry people coordinated the newest EU initiative with Baroness Ashton initiative. I don't know, but I'm just putting it out as a point of debate. It would not surprise me, by the way, because this is something that is going to increase the cost of doing business for Israel, especially if they have to sign a paper stating that this is a territory that does not belong to Israel. Okay, so how would this initiative play out? My assessment of the Kerry initiative is that it's very, very low. Success is low because all the things that existed during the Oslo process exist now. There is no leader. We're still waiting for a Palestinian Nelson Mandela. The nation-building skills have not improved that much. If you want, you can read the reports of the financial reports on the management. There's tremendous corruption. Now, and of course, since then, the right of return of the Palestinians became so much more prominent. In my opinion, this is one of the things that made Arafat hesitant to sign the deal, because he did know at the time the other folks in Camp David too did not know that this was such an issue. So, what was happening in the future? Now, no one knows what the future is, and I, of all people who wrote so many books of predictive failures, should not say anything about the future, but it looked to me that Americans are going to push for a peace process, for some type of a resolution in the future under any administration, be it Democratic or Republican, because they don't want Israel to achieve what they like the best, to say we are in the conflict management mode, because they want to push this issue. And then is something that I want to say, which you may find controversial, and we may discuss it, is part of the national security doctrine of the United States. That is, it's not a written document. I know there's, what is that Hebrew term for Torah shebe'al peh?
Oral tradition.
Oh, it's not a written document, but there is an oral tradition in the military, the State Department, wherever, that should be pursued because it's part of American national interest. So whether it's a failure or a success, mostly a failure, that process would be repeated even if it produces one more failure. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to start with another peace which happened in the Middle East, the peace between Israel and Jordan. Those who looked really into the details of that peace agreement know that I think that the main cornerstone of this peace agreement is the status which Jordan, actually the Hashemite house, received on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Although they have no territorial contiguity to Jerusalem, Jerusalem is not part of Jordan, yet the Jordanian monarchy became some kind of a custodian over the third place in holiness for the Sunni Islam. This gives them much, at least that's what they think, gives them legitimacy, and not only legitimacy, religious legitimacy, and this is in the Middle East very important, especially when we see now what happens in Syria, where the regime is viewed as infidel regime because they are Alawis and they are idol worshippers. So if you combine the legitimacy of the Jordanian house being driven from their status in the Temple Mount on one side, and the fact that the Syrian regime has no legitimacy because it is an infidel sect, definitely you can see how important the religious component for any peace, like between Israel and Jordan, and the lack of peace, which is internally in Syria. So this is just to feel how much religion is important, unlike in this country, where religion shouldn't play any role in politics. Of course, it has some presence, but not such a major role as it has in the Middle East. Therefore, if you want to achieve any peace in the Middle East, you should start with a main problem of peace, which is religion. And from Kissinger to Kerry, I'm sorry to note that religion was not taken in account. Religion was not addressed in those agreements, and the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians usually ignored the religious component of the Israeli Arab, or if you want, the Jewish Islamic struggle over the land of Israel. And this is why I think there is no peace, because it didn't start from the right point. If we look at the problem, where the problem lies, we Jews are viewed in, I would say, three bad points by Muslims. First of all, according to Islam, Judaism ceased to exist since Christianity came to the world, and Christianity ceased to exist since Islam came to the world. You know, the theory of replacement in the Islamic version. The Jews, Raya wa Baddalu, means those who changed and forged the Holy Scriptures. The Jews are descendants of apes and swines. The Jews are those who killed the prophets, and so forth. And Jews, of course, according to the first surah of the Islam, of the Quran, are those upon whom the wrath of Allah rests. Al-Maghdub alayhim. And therefore, when we try to understand how Muslims in general, and Palestinians included, are looking at Jews, are those who should be living maybe under the Islamic rule as dhimmis, as al-dhimma, those who live under the Islamic rule, according to the Islamic rule, not people who have sovereignty and freedom. And this is the basic problem of how Islam as a religion views the Jews, and it definitely overshades the negotiations between Muslims and Jews about peace wherever we like. Second thing, Muslims view Jews not as a nation, not as a people, but as communities, which belong everywhere where they live in the world. In Poland, where my parents came from, there are Christians and there are Jews, and all are Polish from the national point of view. Jews in Yemen are Yemenite Arabs who happen to be Jewish, just like other Yemenite Arabs who happen to be Muslims. And in Morocco, there are Moroccan Arabs who happen to be Jewish, and so forth. In Iraq, in the United States of America, they are Americans who embrace the Jewish religion, just like others who are Christians or Muslims. So, in their view, Jews as communities which belong to every nation in the world, since they are not a nation and not as a people, why do they need a state? Why do they need a country? They don't need it. They can stay wherever they are, even in Poland and in Germany, because they are part of those nations. There is no reason for Jews to come and to become a nation. This is not right. They are not a nation. So in this point, they project on us Jews their issues, because Islam never made the Persians and the Arabs and the Baluchis and the Chechenians, who are all Muslims, never made them into one nation. Ummah, yes. Ummah means the Islamic Ummah, yes, but not as a nation from the nation point of view. They have different languages, different mindset, different cultures, different food, different clothing. So they are not the same nation. So they project on us, Jews, the same problem with Islam. Since Islam failed to unite all the communities, Islamic communities, into one real nation, they think that we are not also a nation. So why the heck do we need a country? A third problem between Islam and Israel is the status of the land of Palestine, which they call, or the Eretz Israel. In the Islamic mindset, a land has only one-way ticket to enter Islam. A land cannot leave the bosom of Islam. By the way, Spain is the same problem, Sicily, the same problem, parts of the Balkans, the same problem. They still fantasize on regaining those countries because once in history they were part of the Islamic house. So the same is about Palestine. So since Palestine was occupied by Umar al-Khattab, the biggest terrorist of the 7th century, who occupied the land of Israel, ever since the end, he declared that this is a Waqf land, holy endowment land. So this is why the land of Israel should forever remain in the Islamic land. So how come those Jews whose religion is void, who are not even a nation, how come they come to Israel or to the Palestine and take it and extract it from the Islamic law? So this is why in Islam, the views to Israel as the land of the Jewish people is so problematic, and this is why they refuse to recognize Israel as the state of the Jewish nation, as Netanyahu demands now. Because Jewish nation doesn't exist. Well, they are as people, but not as a religion. Inna din inda Allahi al-Islam. There is a verse in the Quran. The religion that Allah is only Islam, not Christianity and not Judaism, of course. And so Israel as a Jewish state is some kind of oxymoron. Jewish state, it cannot be, because Judaism doesn't mean anything anymore. And a state, what do they need state? There are communities. So if you combine all these problematic points by which Islam looks at Judaism in general, Jews and Israel in particular, you can find the hard, I would say the core of the problems between Israel and the Palestinians, because they are, of course, Muslims. So ignoring all these things caused I would say this march of stupidity to go forward before you solve the problems in Islam. Because if you don't begin a new discourse in Islam, which will legitimize Jews as people, which will not legitimize Judaism as a religion, valid, a vivid religion, a religion with rights, just like Muslims have rights, if you don't try to deal with the fact that any country which was ever under Islamic rule should remain Islamic, if you don't try to open these problems, you cannot go forward really in a peace process between Israel and the Arabs in general and Palestinians, because they are all Muslims. So I don't remember any time in history of the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians when these issues were addressed. Whoever talked about this? I never, even President Clinton, when he came after the signing of the Oslo agreements in '93, when he came to the Knesset, he quoted all kinds of verses from the Bible about peace and so forth, but he didn't deal with the problems of religion, especially from the other side, from the Islamic side. Just to demonstrate what I say, it's not any kind of theory. Palestinians are going around in demonstrations with this cloth, as you might see in many cases. On one side they claim Al-Quds Lana, means Jerusalem is ours. On the other side, they show Palestine, the whole country. So where is Israel? Since the message is that Jerusalem is theirs, means Jerusalem does not belong anymore to Judaism, because Judaism is void. So this is why the whole country belongs to them. And this is the combination between two sides. And this is issued by the PLO, not by Hamas. And this is the flag of the PLO. So when the message is religious Jerusalem, how can you go forward in any political solution to religious problems? Because religious problems need a solution from the religious field. You cannot deal with one disease with medications for another disease. You have to deal with it, with the problem as it is. If the problem is religious, or if the core problem is a religion, or the basis of the problem is Israel and the Muslims is religious, you have to deal with the religious. So where is the hope? And there is hope. Every year, for several years, we have in Jerusalem gay parade, sometime I think in May. And they march in the streets, as they do in many cities in the world. Every single year, some week before this gay parade, a document appears in the press. And in this document, the mayor of Jerusalem is requested not to allow this gay parade march in the holy city of Jerusalem. The signatories of this document are the chief mufti of Jerusalem, the Islamic authority, the chief rabbi of Jerusalem, the Jewish authority, and the chief bishop, one of the bishops of Jerusalem, means the Christian side of the equation. They all sign this document demanding that the gay parade will not march. Means, and they know The rabbi knows that the other signatories are the Muslim and the Christian, and so the Muslims know the rabbi is signing, and the bishop of the bishop knows also. Means that there are issues that the three religions can agree, especially when it comes to gay parade. So, and this is the solution. When the three religions, and you know what, I take for granted that Christianity will agree to peace. But when the problem is the rabbi and the Islamic guy, if they agree that peace is as important as canceling the gay parade, they will sit together and they will formulate some kind of a document which both can sign about peace, because they know each other from the signatures on the gay parade. Okay? So when they decide that peace is important enough, just like gay parade, they will sit together and they will formulate a peace agreement between the religions, and this can be the basis for politicians to carry on and to implement the religious peace into a political agreement, because no politician will dare to challenge anything which was accepted by religious authorities. A peace agreement achieved by politicians will definitely be challenged by religious authorities from both sides, because it didn't start from those people of religion. This is why, since the core problem of peace is religion, peace should start with the religious authorities. When they agree on anything, politicians will enter the room in order to continue and to build upon the religious peace some political peace as well. Insha'Allah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Means peace upon you, the mercy of Allah and His blessings.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm gonna stay here. That's okay.
Good.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. And thank you to all of you for being here this morning, and thank you, Asaf, and thank you for including me on such a wonderful panel with Ofira and Motti. I'm just going to speak very briefly and somewhat impressionistically. What I want to do is just sort of step back for a second and talk about two separate things in terms of the peace process. Also to get a look at it from what it is, to get a larger perspective of what it has meant in the past to U.S. policymakers. So I think that does give a useful, helpful perspective. So the first question I want to ask is, what do we mean by peace and the peace process? When we talk about peace, historically, when we talk about the Pax Romana, that means it was the Romans' peace. When we talk about the Pax Americana, that means it's the American peace. Peace is not just an abstraction. In lots of ways, it's post-World War II Europe, the way the Europeans talk about peace, as though peace is an abstract good. It's something that people work toward and there's no more fighting. And they get along and they live together. But that's not really historically what peace is. Peace is the fruits of victory. And that's what we mean by the Pax Romana, and that's what we mean by the Pax Americana. And part of the fruits of the victory of the Pax Americana is the American position in the Persian Gulf and the American position in the Middle East. If we look at it in that way, that peace is what someone imposes, that peace is what someone has, I would say in lots of ways, looking at Israel's position in the Middle East, I would say Israel already has a peace in the historical sense of the word. Israel has a state with which it defends oftentimes through force. That doesn't mean you don't have peace, just because you have to use force to defend what is yours. Historically, this is what we mean by peace. And if we look at other places, and then even in the modern Western European sense of the word, Israel has peace as well, with two significant Arab states, one a little more significant than the others, Egypt and Jordan. If we look around at the rest of the region, and we can see this most poignantly now as conflict, the center of conflict in the region is in Syria, where there's a real live, vivid shooting war, and in many ways a continuation or a rebirth of a very long and very old and extraordinarily dangerous Sunni-Shiite conflict. And if you look at what's going on in Syria, and if you talk about various peace processes, well, why don't the Alawites have a peace treaty with any of the Sunnis? Why don't the Shiites have a peace treaty with the Sunnis? That's just not the way that the region looks. But if you step back and look at it like this, and if you talk about why don't, for instance, the Maronites of Lebanon have a peace process, or why don't they have a peace treaty with the Sunnis, or why don't they have a peace treaty with the Shiite? That's just not generally the way the region works. Generally, the way the region works is what Israel has done is basically impose its own peace, and everyone else fights for a long time. Now, if you step back and look at how the Americans understand this, how American policymakers have understood it for a long time, you have anyone from Brzezinski to Baker to Gates up until the present day with John Kerry, who all believe, let me just come back. The second issue that I want to talk about, which I'll lead into right now, the first question is, what do we mean by peace? The second question is, what is the strategic purpose of the process? And I think in lots of ways, American policymakers over the last 40 years, since 1973, have lost track of what the purpose, the strategic purpose of the peace process is. I think a lot of people have come to understand peace as an absolute good, peace between the Arabs and the Israelis, peace most specifically between the Palestinians and the Israelis, as a good in its own right. Isn't it important in the Holy Land that these two peoples whose histories are so important and whom we value so much, that they should have peace, they should be able to live in peace? Arguably, from the American perspective, peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis is not in the American interest. Arguably, what is in the American interest is continued and protracted conflict. Not that it gets too far out of hand, but that there is conflict. Because what the peace process did in 1973, the way that Henry Kissinger perceived this, was that what would happen is after the 73 war, Kissinger saw an advantage, as Martin Kramer, the president of Shalem, has put it, to turn a weakness into a strength. And what he did through the airlifts and what he did by backing Israel so strongly was holding the Israelis in a warm hug, showing the Arabs that they had no chance of ever defeating the Israelis in war. If what they wanted was different concessions, anything from withdrawals at different points to pressure on the Israelis, they would have to come to Washington to get it. They would have to come to American policymakers because there was no way that they would be able to do that on their own. Over the years, it seems that American policymakers lost the thread. They forgot there was actually a strategic purpose to the peace process. Peace in itself was not important enough from the American perspective. And plus, as I think everyone in this room would agree, it looks futile and ridiculous unless there's a larger purpose to it. And the larger purpose, again, for a long time, was to secure the American position in the region. Let me just bring this up to the present day very quickly. As we saw over the last 4 years, or actually maybe the first 3 years, the Obama administration's first term, that the president believed very strongly in making peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. At a certain point, it seems that he thought that it was less important. It was a failure, and he didn't want to fail again. It was John Kerry, as we understand, when he was named Secretary of State, who thought that the peace process was important. Among other things, he wanted to have this on his resume, part of his historical legacy. He thought that there was actually an opportunity for peace between the Israelis and Palestinians. We saw something very interesting happen a few weeks ago, or actually it was just last week, when Kerry was in Jerusalem And Kerry went on, I believe, I can't remember what TV station it was, but he was interviewed by both an Israeli journalist and a Palestinian journalist. And when he started berating the Israeli government, at that point it became clear that the United States government at this point no longer saw the peace process as a good in its own right. And I'm speaking very impressionistically here. I only have some facts I can point to. What the purpose of the peace process was at this point, Kerry may still believe in the peace process. I believe that Obama saw failure over the first term, and the thing he learned from the peace process was that you might not be able to get peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, but what you can do is you can beat up an Israeli prime minister over the peace process, and you can basically neutralize him for quite a long time. Domestically, he has a lot to defend against. Internationally, he's very weak. And in terms of his relationships with the United States, they're very fragile as well, if you batter him. Now, the reason the administration would want to batter Netanyahu at this point is, of course, to keep him sidelined because there's a much more important negotiation from the administration's perspective that's going on. And that negotiation, of course, is happening right now at Geneva. The P5+1 and Iran talks, which of course mostly about the US and Iran. But what I want to say in summation, I think it's fascinating actually, because I think if you look in some ways, Obama, as much as I disagree with his policies, I think that this is sort of a return to, I think actually he does have a sense for strategy in some ways. Because if you look at what the purpose of the peace process was, Kissinger's purpose of the peace process, it was to hold the Israelis so closely and to become so close to the Israelis that the Arabs knew this was what the Pax Americana was based on. That the Arabs knew there was no way that they could touch the Israelis without the Americans backing them to the hilt, which made it very dangerous for Arab states to want to take on the Israelis again. What's happening here at Geneva, when Obama announced that Rouhani was effectively not only a peace partner, but that Rouhani was one of the keys for securing one of the president's key initiatives in his second term, which was historical reconciliation with Iran. So what we see has happened, it's almost come full circle, because what the administration is doing right now is embracing Rouhani. And in embracing Rouhani, what they've done is they've put a very difficult choice before the government of Israel, which is, will you attack Iranian nuclear facilities when the Iranians have been embraced so closely by the United States? Will you go against the United States, or will you do what you said, or what this prime minister said he's going to do? That he will make sure that he prevents an Iranian nuclear weapon. But again, if you look at it, if you try to look at it objectively, to see the different movements on the board, it's fascinating how what we've seen actually is this president looking at talks, not just in terms of peace, but in terms of how you sideline different people, which from the American strategic perspective, this was the purpose of the peace process. Not just peace in its own right, but isolating certain actors and insulating others. And I think that's what we're seeing now in many ways.
Thank you. Great. I want to thank all our three panelists for all their correct and very astute observations on these issues. I'm sorry, but our time is unfortunately up, so I have to cut us short. But I want to thank my panel, and thank you so much.